Hello and welcome to part 2 in our segment related to Baroque art. In this video we're going to be looking at the Baroque style in France, French Baroque. We had just looked at French, and we're going to be focusing on architecture, so we had just looked at Italian Baroque architecture in Italy. Now we're going to move up into France. And the Baroque really did move across Europe. So we're not going to, it happened in England as well, and other, in other countries, but we're just going to focus on Italy and France for our purposes. So what I'm showing you right now is a portrait of Louis the 14th, who was known as the Sun King, and this was a portrait done by Hyacinthe Rigaud, or Rigaud, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right. And so this is a royal portrait done of Louis XIV. Again, you don't have to know this one, but I wanted to give you a sense of who Louis XIV was, because we're actually going to be looking at his extravagant palace in Versailles. I'm sure you've heard of that. And I think knowing a little bit about him and, getting to know him through this very extravagant portrait will give you a better sense of the Palace of Versailles as well, and how that developed. So Louis XIV, and he reigned from 1638 to 1715. He was known as the Sun King. He was the King of France and of Navarre, and he reigned from 1643 until his death in 1715. So his reign started at the age of 4 years old and lasted for about 72 years, 3 months and 18 days, and it's the longest reign of any European monarch. Hyacinthe Rigaud was one of the most important portrait painters during the reign of King Louis XIV. His instinct for the impressive pose and grand presentation precisely suited the taste of the royal personage, ambassadors, clerics, courtiers, and financiers who sat for him. So this is actually a Baroque style painting, French Baroque. So I don't want to focus too much on it, but I feel like you can get a lot from this, a lot about Louis XIV's personality by looking at this portrait. He is said to have been a very good dancer, so he's showing off his legs, and he is trying to elevate his height by wearing these sort of high heel shoes. Anyway, I'm going to move on to another part. And so this portrait is really a lot about power in terms of the juxtaposition. When we look at the king, he seems to really dwarf his throne in the background, so that really emphasizes him and his prestige and power. He's really almost nearly the height of the column in the background that we see depicted, and his scepter that he's holding looks incredibly small next to him. So all of these sort of scaling of these objects around him are meant to sort of emphasize his greatness and giving him a larger sense of who he is. All this giving the impression of him being even taller. The bright curtains are red. Red has been since antiquity a symbol of wealth and power. It was the color often found in a king's daily life, so we see this gorgeous red. And the curtain's red matches the carpet's golden dyes right here that we see, and both have the same role. So we really see the king really surrounded by these very luxurious materials. The ermine-lined cape, and this really silky cloak, or part of his clothing with the fleur-de-lis. It's all very lavish and, again, very dramatic and rich, and really very much of that Baroque style. So let me just show you some details. here you can really get a sense of the clothing and the detail that went into this. And again, his clothing choices aren't random. You know, the coronation robe, this blue deep color embroidered with the fleur-de-lis, and, you know, this sort of lace detailing on the sleeves, you know, the silk stockings, the red shoes. All of this is really showcasing his extravagance and wealth. Not only that he's the king of France, but also because he represents France, this also is supposed to represent the country of France's wealth, and that this era during France was one of growth and enrichment, not of poverty and war. So I'm going to move on because I really don't want to focus too much on this. I want to talk about the Palace of Versailles. But I think looking at that portrait and then getting a sense of, you know, really that King Louis XIV really appreciated the finer things in life. So this is the Palace of Versailles. King Louis decided to move the French court from Paris, the capital, to Versailles. He commissioned the building of a complex that included a court of 3,000 residents, including the king and queen, members of the royal family, government ministers, aristocrats, diplomats, civil servants, and the like. And so this required a very grand building, and no expense was spared. Indeed, the new complex became you know, the sort of center of France, and, you know, basically he sort of uprooted the capital and just sort of moved it into the smaller town. And the palace was surrounded by 800, more than 800, beautifully immaculate gardens with beautiful vistas, fountains, and statues. We'll take a look at some of the details of those. And the palace contained several suites of apartments for public and private use of the king and queen, as well as other architectural highlights that we're going to look at. The Palace of Versailles was built between 1624 and 98, and it's a magnificent example of French Baroque architecture. It's the most famous royal chateau in France. The gigantic scale of Versailles exemplifies the architectural theme of creation by division, a series of simple repetitions rhythmically marked off by the repetition of the large windows, which express the fundamental values of Baroque art. We'll look at that when we look at the facade of the structure. And then we're also going to be looking at the inside of the interior, which is just as lavish and beautiful as the outside. So here's an aerial view. So it's quite expansive. And then here's sort of a map to kind of lay out. And the reason why I'm showing you this, and this is also incorporating the gardens as well, but the architect was Louis Leval and Julius, I cannot pronounce French, I'm so sorry, but anyway, you can read it right there. I need to go back and learn how to pronounce these names. So what's interesting is that there are all these axle points of entrance into the palace, and they all converge to one location at the center of the complex, and this is where Louis's bedroom was, and really he literally thought of himself as the Sun King. And so when the king rose in the mornings, he would hold audience in his bedroom. And, you know, it really shows that the sun was really very symbolic of his identity. So he really saw himself like the sun. So where he dictated the beginning and ending of the day. And he would also probably hold court before he went to bed. And it wasn't unusual during these times for kings and queens to sort of hold audience in their bedroom. And it was very public, you know, the ritual of getting up and getting dressed. I mean, there might be an audience to watch that. It was very, very different than what we think of today. So here's another aerial view. It's quite beautiful. So you get a really sense of, this is the main structure, and then you have these beautiful gardens. And here's a facade. When the chateau was built, Versailles was a country village. Today, however, it's a wealthy suburb of Paris. It's about 20 kilometers southwest of the French capital. The court of Versailles was the center of political power in France from 1682, when Louis XIV moved from Paris, until the royal family was forced to return to the capital in October of 1789 after the beginning of the French Revolution. The town of Versailles was bought by a man named Albert de Gondi, a naturalized Florentine who invited Louis XIII on several, so this is Louis XIV's father, on several hunting trips in the forest surrounding Versailles. He was so pleased with the location, Louis ordered the construction of a hunting lodge in 1624. 8 years later, Louis obtained the rights of Versailles, or the land rights from the Gondi family, and began to enlarge the chateau and expand it and renovate it. And this structure, this small hunting lodge that was started by King Louis XIV's father, would become the core of this really grand palace that we see today. So this is just a diagram that shows you the expansion. So it wasn't built in just, one long, it just wasn't built in one structure. It really went through this renovation and expansion through many different years. And you can see how it has grown. So Louis XIII's successor, Louis XIV, had expanded it into one of the largest palaces in the world. And in 1678, he began to gradually move the court from Paris to Versailles. And the royal court, was officially established there on May 6, 1682. And this was a big deal to sort of uproot and move the court from Paris to Versailles. So let's talk about the French Baroque style. The Baroque style became more restrained in France. So when we look at it in Italy, it was very exuberant, very dramatic and theatrical, and we still have some of those elements, but it's a little bit more restrained. It still has these very lavish details, but the French buildings were usually symmetrical and orderly. French Baroque is characterized by restrained movement. So keep that term and try to use that, restrained. And the facade sections seem to push back and pull forward. So it's a little bit more subtle in the movement. So here you have the section sort of receding back, and then you have the section coming forward. And so there's this sort of rhythm that's a little bit more subtle, but it still has that movement and energy that is characteristic of Baroque. So this is very different from that dramatic convex facade of that Italian Baroque church by Borromini that we looked at in the last segment, San Carlo al Quattro Fonti in Rome. But they're still Baroque, they're just regional differences. So this is French, the church by Borromini was Italian. So the first level here, and you can see the different elevations, was called the podium, P-O-D-I-U-M, and this is where the main palace rests. And so this is actually the area where the servants lived and worked. The second level was the main living floor for the royal family and the aristocrats. So it had a very utilitarian design, so that the servants would, be able to sort of enter the building and not disturb, the royal and the aristocrats. And, you've seen Downton Abbey. I mean, that's a totally different time period, but that sort of same idea. I'm sorry, I messed up. So this is just a detail too of the courtyard, which is absolutely gorgeous. And we do see a lot of these kind of Baroque details, recesses, and lots of beautiful sort of niches and sculpture. But again, a lot more restrained. Now we're going to take a look at the interior. This is referred to, this part of the interior of Versailles is called the Hall of Mirrors, and this was started in 1678. As the principal and most remarkable feature of King Louis XIV's Palace of Versailles, the construction of the Hall of Mirrors was a really magnificent project and quite an undertaking. The principal feature of this hall is the 17 mirror-clad arches that you see here. That reflect the 17 arcade windows that go along the other side, and these overlook the garden. Each arch contains 21 mirrors with a total complement of 357 used in the decoration. The arches themselves are fixed between marble pilasters, whose capitals depict the symbol of France. So here are these marble pilasters, so very lavish and lots of very luxurious materials. These gilded bronze capitals, this is here, include the fleur-de-lis, which was a symbol of France, and also the Gallic cockerel, or a rooster, which was also a symbol of France. Let me see if I can zoom in better. It's hard to see. Anyway, look at some other views. So the mirrors were really helpful in enlarging the space and giving the illusion that the room really seemed to go on forever. And so when you enter this space, it's very overwhelming, I think. In the 17th century, it was decided that the materials for the construction and decoration of the Palace of Versailles should be purely French affair. So they didn't want to import anything from any other country. So everything from tapestries to mirrors were to be manufactured in France. The problem was that in those days, Venice had virtually a monopoly on the manufacture of mirrors. To get around this, the French convinced a number of Venetian artists to defect and come to make mirrors for the Great Hall. So they kind of stole these Venetian artisans. In response, the Venetian government ordered the assassination of the treacherous artisans to keep the secrets of how to make mirrors a secret from the French. So there's some scandal and intrigue for you there. All right, so we're going to focus on some of the gardens and the landscaping. So the gardener and landscaper for Louis XIV was André Le Notre. And so we're looking at an aerial view and a drawing of the gardens and some of the fountains. So situated to the west of the palace, the gardens cover some 800 hectares, and that's a measurement of land, and much of which is landscaped in a very classic French garden style that was perfected by André Le Notre, who was a French landscape architect and the principal gardener of King Louis XIV of France. So one of the commanding features of the garden is the canal located on a vertical axis that is 1 mile long, ending and marking the central part of the garden. So I think this is the area we're talking about. I think this is what the area where King Louis's bedroom was. And here's another aerial view and drawing of the gardens. To water the gardens, there was no electricity during this time, so they had to use pumps that were driven by a long mechanical linkage that connected to a water wheel located in a nearby river. The river's flow made the water wheel turn, and cranked the mechanism of the water wheel, made a series of iron rods that would oscillate back and forth, each one pushing on to the next one, all the way up the riverbank and and into the pump house in the gardens. So there were 14 water wheels total that brought water to the fountain. So there were over 1,400 fountains. So they needed quite a lot of water. And they sort of ran into a problem with that. Here's another view of the gardens and the landscaping. So it's very, very pristine and manicured. Here you can see sort of the symbol of the fleur-de-lis etched out. And then as you walk through these gardens, you have these beautiful fountains. So Louis wanted the grounds, the gardens, to have a new delight at every turn and corner. There was not enough water to have all the fountains on at the same time, because there were 1,400. So when Louis was walking the grounds, attendants actually had to run ahead to turn fountains on before Louis got there. Since Louis thought of himself as the Sun King, the theme of the sun god Apollo is a reoccurring motif in many of the fountain decorations that you see here. So you see Apollo on his chariot with his horses. And so it's really crazy. I mean, you think about these attendants, they would run ahead of Louis and turn the fountain on, and then when he would left, they would run back and turn it off. And so there was this whole, stage, this theater, being presented for this king, that he really did live in this really fantasy palace. We're going to be looking at some statues that are also in the garden. This is a drawing, and then here's a statue of another image of Apollo. And again, I'm just showing you elements just to give you a sense of how lavish this property was. This was from the grotto of Thetis from the Palace of Versailles in France. And if you think about it, this is probably how Louis XIV really saw himself. He really saw himself as this god and the sun god, and having these beautiful nymph or attendants sort of attend to his every need. And so this is probably very, very much representative of how Louis viewed himself. That's why I'm showing you this. Here's a close-up. The style of this sculpture, again, is very classical Baroque. And what I mean by that, it's a very Baroque translation of classic style. So when you look at these figures and the wet drapery, they're very classic. The anatomy, the figures, the drapery. But there's a certain movement about this sculpture that is Baroque and theatrical. There's a circular yet restrained movement that's implied in sort of how these nymph figures surround Apollo. So again, like when we talked about with the Italian church by Borromini, these sort of classical architectural elements, but presented in a non-classical way. And so sculpture also was dealt with, I think, in a similar approach, where it was very, classical elements, but the presentation was very Baroque and dramatic. All right. So that's the end of part 2. We will be looking further into the Baroque period. We're actually going to be looking at Baroque painting. Going back to Italy, we'll be also going to Spain as well in later segments, so stay tuned. Also, please remember, I'm going to go back to this. Please remember to view the Khan Academy videos that I have uploaded in your resource folder that corresponds to this segment. All right, hope you have a good weekend. Bye.